Last week, I told you that July inflation was almost certainly going to be ugly. I was wrong. I think the people who read this every week deserve honesty, so I have to be real with you. But in my defense, oil was over $90 a barrel. The war was re escalating. Every indicator pointed toward a bad inflation print, okay? Then July CPI came out at 0.1% for the month. Annual inflation dropped to 3.4% from 3.5% in June. Core inflation, which strips out food and energy, came in at 2.5% annually. Energy fell 1.5% in July. Gas prices dropped almost 3% month over month. The September rate hike odds were sitting at 57% before last Friday's jobs report. Then they dropped to 42% after Wednesday's CPI. The bond market exhaled, long story short, and mortgage rates gave us a little bit of improvement. So, what does being wrong about inflation change for my advice heading into this fall? I'm about to explain it all, so stay tuned. No one is selling, so no one can be buying. That is what Carl Weinberg, chief economist at High Frequency Economics, said this week, and it kind of explains everything. The whole economic situation in America and how it's translating into the real estate market in plain English. Here's his direct quote. No one who has a home can afford to sell it. People with ultra-low COVID-era mortgages cannot afford to give them up. If no one is selling, no one can be buying. Inventory is low. That's the lock-in effect, isn't it? And it is the primary reason the housing market has been stuck near a 30-year low in sales volume for 3 straight years, despite a labor market that, until last week, has been reasonably healthy. July existing home sales fell 1.7% to 4.06 million annualized. The median home price rose 2% to 434,100. Inventory dipped to 1.5 million. Home sales have been hovering near that 4 million pace for 3 years, which is really far below the historical norm of 5.2 million. The population hasn't dwindled. Housing formations sure as shit aren't declining. It's because sellers are trapped. That's where I want to revisit something that I said back in January. So think about this. The person who bought in 2020 at under 3% is now looking at 7% for the next house. Them not wanting to move is not irrational. They're just doing the math, and the math says stay in this home, which means the inventory that buyers desperately need is locked inside homes whose owners don't want them but can't afford to leave them. When I told you that 2026 was your last best window to buy, that hypothesis had 2 engines. The first was that rate relief was coming, and that lower rates would finally make the monthly payment math work for more buyers. The second, which I think got less attention than it deserved, was that rate relief was supposed to unlock sellers. The person trapped at 2.9% does not need rates to fall just for buyers. They also need rates to fall so they can afford to leave. When a 3% seller can move up to 5.5% mortgage instead of a 7% one, the math changes enough to motivate them to sell. And when they list, inventory improves. And when inventory improves, buyers get choices on top of leverage they haven't had since before the pandemic. The war killed both engines at once. Rate relief got delayed, and because rate relief got delayed, the sellers who were supposed to take off the golden handcuffs and list are still sitting. We did not lose better rates just for buyers. We lost that, but we also lost the inventory those rate-motivated sellers would have created. This is the compounding cost of the war on this housing market that nobody's really talking about. It was not just about the monthly payment, it was also about supply when rates went up. Then there's Zillow's data that they reported, and why a lag effect really matters when it comes to real estate data. So Zillow reported that home sales in July experienced their strongest gain of 2026, up 7% year over year. That sounds like great news, and it is, with one little asterisk. July sales reflect deals that went under contract weeks earlier, when mortgage rates were improving on the news of a peace deal. But Zillow also warned, unless rates reverse course, mortgage rates will be higher than they were last August, which means monthly payments will be higher than they were last August. That is the lag effect. The good July sales number is a reflection of June confidence. The August number will reflect July's re-escalation, the negative jobs report, the 6.7% interest rates we're dealing with right now. The data you see today is always in the rearview mirror, which means the housing market is going to feel and experience August before the data reports it. Watch pending sales weekly because that is a real-time indicator of what's actually happening in the housing market. And now, to put all these numbers in context and how they feel for the average person on Main Street, income needed to afford a median-priced home has risen to over $120,000. Doesn't seem crazy, right? Everything's expensive now. A lot of people earn $120,000 a year. But I have to tell you that back in 2020, the median income required to afford a house was $66,000. Yikes. The income required to comfortably afford a median-priced American home has nearly doubled in 6 years. Not because wages doubled, they didn't. Because prices ran up 37% while rates went from 3% to 8% back down to the 6 to 7%. The Corcoran Group CEO made an observation this week that I think is worth sitting with, regardless about how you feel about the rest of her advice, which was very Dave Ramsey-esque. She said, Gen Z's housing market struggles mirror what boomers faced 30 years ago. She's not wrong about this parallel, guys. Boomers entered the housing market in the 1980s and early 1990s when mortgage rates were between 10 and 18%. And I know you're going to tell me that prices were lower, but they still felt impossible compared to wages. The headlines were full of reasons to buy, not to buy. The headlines told people not to buy. The conventional wisdom said you should wait this out. The boomers who bought anyway, who stretched, who found creative financing, who bought the less desirable neighborhood or the smaller house, are now the wealthiest generation in American history. Their home equity is the foundation of that wealth. The $124 trillion wealth transfer to younger generations that's going to start in 2028 is almost entirely built on real estate purchase during the decades that felt just like this year feels. The generation that bought when it was hard is the generation that ended up the most wealthy. And that is not an argument to ignore your personal financial reality. If the payment doesn't work, it does not work. But it is worth understanding the structural difficulty of entering the housing market is not new. It's not a phenomenon. Generations and generations have found a way through it, and they didn't regret it. The income required to buy has nearly doubled since 2020. That is real and that is hard. It is exactly the kind of moment that separates the buyers who build generational wealth from the ones who wait for the conditions that at this point may never arrive. The people who bought before 2022 look like geniuses now, don't they? The people who didn't are staring at a market that requires more income and has gotten harder to compete in. But the $120,000 threshold assumes a conventional loan with 20% down at current rates. FHA rates change that math. A rate buydown changes that math. A dual income household changes that math. The modern earner whose bank account says something very different than their tax return does changes that math. The structural problem is real, you guys. The numbers are real, but it is also applied to a market where anything is not average. Anything and everything is outside of average. Every house is still its own market. The $120,000 tells you that there's a national average. There's an environment. It doesn't tell you what to do with that information. It doesn't tell you that the right lender can change all the math for you if they have the right product for you. It doesn't tell you what's impossible or possible for you specifically. So what does this all mean going into the fall? Inflation deceleration is real, at least for now. But here's the context worth understanding before you get too excited about that. PGIM, the investment arm of Prudential Financial, called for 3 rate hikes this year back on June 22nd. The Bank of America said the same. And a lot of people are hanging their hat. A lot of lenders, a lot of realtors, a lot of financial advisors are hanging their hat on that advice. But they made those calls when CPI was at 4.1%, when oil was near $100 a barrel, and the war was escalating. The data this week moved against all of it. It didn't make any of those facts not true, but September hike odds have dropped. The negative jobs report and the tame CPI numbers are the clearest argument against a September rate hike. PJIM's call is not dead. It's just data dependent, and so therefore it's dated. The September 11th CPI report covering August data, that's the next test. And there's a gas price momentum building from late July that has not yet shown up in the data. Gasoline prices climbed through the second half of July and will feed into August's reading and may substantiate PGIM's call. But I could be wrong again. And We could actually see a pause or a cut in September just based on the labor market. The honest picture here heading into the fall is that the rate environment is less hostile than it was 2 weeks ago, but the lock-in effect is still very real. The inventory that my original hypothesis for 2026 assumed would come, motivated by rate relief and seller confidence, has not materialized the way anyone hoped. Another but. The window that was supposed to close because rates improved is still open, because rates have not improved enough to bring your competition back. So maybe all of this is not a reason to wait. The sellers who cannot wait are still the best opportunity in this market. The expired listings, the motivated builders across the country, the institutional investors dropping inventory into the market. Do with this information what you will. Happy Friday.